All right, everyone. Hello and good evening. It is 5 o'clock, so I am going to go ahead and get this started. I am here with Jordan Hanssen. Hi, Jordan.
Hello, good to see everybody.
So I am here at the Foss Waterway Seaport again in Tacoma, Washington, and I have Jordan with me, who is going to regale us with the story of his 2006 race in a rowboat across the Atlantic. So the way we're going to work this today is I'm going to be monitoring both Facebook and Zoom here for the questions, which you can type in the chat to us. And then at the end, we'll pick a few for Jordan to answer. All right, so I'm going to get out of your way, Jordan, and I can't wait to hear your story. Thanks for coming.
All right, my pleasure for being here. I want to thank Julia and Foss Seaport for creating some opportunities for me to share this story in these interesting times. This has been a rewarding thing to do for me. I've been doing a presentation in this one form or another for several years now, and this just feels like a very useful thing to do. And I guess not being on the front lines or anything like that. This is just feels really good. So I am thankful for the opportunity to share. So I'm going to share this screen and we'll get this story started. So, day 67, out at sea. If you've ever been to sea, you're going to know that the weather can sometimes draw a sharp line across the sky. And this particular night, we were stuck in a 9 square mile box. Uh, this We'd been stuck there for what seemed like days, and the wind and wave pattern was basically just allowing us to row this treadmill. And we had been running out of food for weeks, and so we were hungry. And right there, as the sun starts traveling down beneath the horizon, there's this line that draws between the sun and the darkness. And out of the darkness comes red and green lights. And if you've been to sea, you know that if you see red and green lights, that means that something is coming your way. And if you were out a few hundred miles off the shore of England, chances are chances are it's going to be a freighter. And that's exactly what it was. So this was nothing new. This was something that at this point, was old hat. We'd seen lots of freighters. We'd seen them pass us dozens and dozens of times. And so we got on the VHF radio and started to call this one. And we tried channel 16, which is the emergency channel. We tried channel 13, and this freighter kept getting closer and closer. And usually it would have just naturally picked a side, but these red and green lights, they just held true, which meant it was still headed right towards us. So this was becoming more and more of a concern. But the hunger was just not letting us think through this problem. And Greg calls the guys on the inside, and we all start looking at this freighter that is now bearing down on us. And I have this idea. We have flares for just such a situation. And I pull them out, and then Greg looks at me and kind of in a very strange way, he says, I haven't had a chance to shoot one off yet. So this ship is bearing down on us, and there's suddenly a strange concern about who gets to shoot off this flare. And this was where our minds were with all the hunger. And this seemed like the most logical thing at the time, because fair is fair out on the ocean. We row together and everybody should have a chance to shoot a flare. So I take these precious seconds and hand him one of these big Solus approved flares. And he grabs it and he's sitting there and he's rocking back and forth as the waves are rocking us, reading the directions. And these are foolproof directions. And there's no response on the VHF radio. Dylan and Brad have kept calling. And then he looks at it and there's a moment of brilliance, and he figures this out and launches the flare into the air. So that's what a freighter looks like when it's coming down upon you. And you may ask yourself at this point, how did we get to this situation? Well, the fact is I fell in love with rowing. I grew up in the deserts of New Mexico. I swam and I got tired of the chlorine. And when I went to school at the University of Washington, University of Puget Sound, sorry, living in Seattle for 15 years. When I was down at the University of Puget Sound, um, I picked up an oar and I just absolutely adored the sport. Um, After college, I was felt like I was good enough that I was going to give rowing at an elite level a try, and so I joined a rowing club up in Washington and started training with this guy, Greg Spooner, in the fall of 2004. And very soon on into this experience, this poster arrived on the wall, and it had this great looking rowboat that was big and beefy, and it was cresting down this bright electric blue wave, and it seemed like it was just this absolute incredible experience. So I asked Greg if he wanted to row across the ocean with me, because that's what this thing was doing. It was advertising a rowing race across the ocean. It had big letters on it that said "One life, live it." And Greg looked at me at I think 5:15 in the morning as we were stretching in front of the poster at the boathouse, and told me no. But I couldn't get this idea out of my head, so I turned to my buddy Brad, who was still at school at the time, and he had these very big dreams. So he seemed like the perfect person to ask. He loved adventure, and it just seemed ripe. So I asked Brad, and he got really quiet. It was on the phone, and he said, "I'll think about it." So they should have given me pause. If Brad said, "I'll think about it," perhaps it was a little bit too big to chew off. But 10 days later, Brad had thought about it, and he decided that it was one of the best things we could do with our young lives at that point. But it was a four-person race. We needed four people. And so we asked another one of our compatriots at the University of Puget Sound rowing team, a guy named Dylan. And Dylan is just one of the most workingest people I know. He's just got these short, thick, sausage-like fingers and calluses, and is one of the most reliable rocks in the boat. You always knew that that boat was going to go fast when Dylan was in it. And we floated this idea to him, and I remember him thinking it over for a week, and he came to me and he said, "I'm trying not to get too excited about this idea, but my mom thinks it's the dumbest idea I've ever had." So I had three of us, myself, Dylan, and Brad, but we needed one more. So I called up Greg and I said, "We got a team." And Greg, after a little bit of hesitation, said yes. So we had this committed team, but the question is, there's Greg right there. Question is how do you row across the ocean? We had no idea what we were doing. We had about 18 months to prepare, and this project. Once we did all the fundraising, we got this boat that you see right here, this gray boat that has just a few pieces of equipment on it. It had three hatches. It had four cleats. It had no ability to row, no sliding seats. It was really just a shell. And that was what we spent about half the time trying to fundraise and figure out how to get over from England, because this was a race. It was a one design. We had to get this boat. And we weren't really sure out of the 14 teams how many would actually make it to the starting line. So we were starting from square one when it came to fundraising, when it came to nonprofit work, when it came to every system on this boat. We were completely amateurs. But for some crazy reason, we felt like we could absolutely do this. And this is what we brought to all of these people in and around the entire Puget Sound area. And we told them, "Hey, we've raised this money to get this boat, and we're going to row it across the ocean, pretty much whether you help us or not." And because of that, we got a whole lot of advice from all over the place. So the fact that we were very earnest and the fact that we had already put skin in the game made people like my friend Dan and Larry at Emerald Harbor Marine. We brought this boat that had nothing on it at the time over to their shop, and these guys are some salty sailors and boat workers. And I would remember after we came back from this trip, Larry told this story about the first time he saw our boat and talked to us. And as him and Dan walked away and they were making the decision on whether or not they would invest their time with us, Larry said, Dan, if we don't help these guys, they're going to flip and die. And Larry used some more adult language than that. Um, we ended up, really not having much more equipment besides a paint job with about 6 months before the race. And we brought it to the boat show. And in order to prove how serious we were, we decided to keep a rowing machine, an ergometer, going for 9 days straight. And the boat show was at the Questfield Events Center. And we slept in the Sounders locker room while our parents brought us food to eat. And we would sleep in the locker room while one person was on the rowing machine and another person was talking to all of the people at the boat show. And through this, we met people like our friend Dave at Gig Harbor Boat Works, who came to us one day and said, "Oh, well, I see you guys are looking for some seats for this. And I have just the seats for you." And so it went with pretty much every single system on the boat. We showed up and we put in the time, and this just drew more and more wonderful people to us. So a few days, actually, while we'd split up the group this one particular day. I was finishing up some boat work while the other guys were packing food. And throughout this project, we would get all kinds of advice. And a lot of this advice was great, and it was sought after, and a lot of this advice was volunteered. And the stuff that was volunteered, it was usually about maybe 10% of it was good. But I'd finished and I was grabbing a meal at a bar in Ballard, and I sat down next to this really salty looking dude, and he turns over to me and he asks what I do, and I told him, well, I'm doing this crazy trip, and he doesn't say much, and he says, it's all about how you survive your first big screw up. And again, he used a little bit more blue language, as you might imagine a salty sailor to say in Ballard. But that really struck me, that there was going to be this moment that I couldn't even imagine, where from this point on, how we survived that was going to dictate the success or failure of this entire trip. So I wanted to include this picture right here because there's the four of us. We got from, let's see, my right to left, Dylan, Brad, Greg, myself, and our housemate, Nick. And this moment we captured because this moment in preparation for this whole project. This is in the kitchen of the house that I still live in. This moment captures the night that the four of us and Nick, who worked for a magazine that he had created, both got funding of several $1,000s. And this was one of the biggest grants we had gotten up to this point. And this was a little bit before, 6 months into this trip, preparing for this. And it was this moment of supreme possibility where all these crazy ideas started to add up, and it just seemed like we would do it. So throughout all of this, we met these wonderful people that you could say were mentors. And if you go back to the origin of that name, mentor is not a vocation, it's a person. Mentor is the manifestation of the goddess of wisdom, Athena, when she appears to Odysseus' son. And so we know Odysseus from the Odyssey, and he is a great adventurer. And he was away from his home in Ithaca for 20 years. And so when he had left, his son was very young, and 20 years later, his father was still gone. And so Telemachus, Odysseus' son, is no longer a boy, but he's not quite a man. And he's wondering where his father is, and he needs to find him. And so Athena comes down and manifests herself as this old man named Mentor and gives him this advice: fit out a ship with 20 oars, the best in sight, and sail in quest of news of your long lost father. And so these endurance events tend to lend themselves to some kind of fundraising. And we wanted to row across the ocean because that's what we wanted to do. We wanted the adventure. We wanted the chance to test ourselves. And maybe that's noble, maybe that's not. But throughout that process, more meaning uh, began getting layered on this whole project. And so for me, uh, my story of my dad's death. So my dad died of asthma when I was 3, and this started to become a theme within this as we started looking for causes that might be meaningful to us to raise money for. And so this was this is what led us to meeting people at the American Lung Association of Washington, who started to help us with our fundraising. And for me, I didn't realize that because I was 22 at the time when this was happening. Uh, I had always felt like I dealt with my father's death very well in a very mature way. I remember, I remember that moment as a 3-year-old, and it was through this process that I realized that I was missing a part of that grief, and that the way that I've thought about it now is that it's you have a childlike grief with things that happen in your childhood that are tragic, and it goes in a box that a child can make. But as you reach as an adult, for me, 20 years later, you need an adult-sized box, and that's what this process started to dredge up for me as I realized that there were things that I needed to think about that were important if I was going to uh, go as a complete person into my future. So this led to us raising money for the American Lung Association of Washington and naming the boat after my father, the James Robert Hanssen. So after 18 months of just beating our heads against the wall and making mistake after mistake after mistake, hours and hours in the boatyard, and tears and laughter and anger and rage and frustration with one another, we made it to New York. And out of the 14 possible spots, 7 teams had signed up and 4 made it to the starting line. So it was us, 2 teams from the British Army and a team of British police officers. And we made it to New York, actually across the Hudson and Jersey City, and began our race across the sea. And so the gun fired and we began to race. And so all these other guys we were racing against they were older than us. They'd been to Iraq. They were, we knew they were tougher than us, but we had spent so much time with so many smart people just uh, fixating over how efficiently we could row this boat. And we knew that we were going to rely on our training as rowers because that's really what we had to do. But keep in mind, like, the 4 of us learned how to row on a flatwater lake, American Lake, south of Tacoma. And now we were going to tackle the North Atlantic Ocean. So fireworks blasted, and late into the evening, the last thing I remember seeing is the lights of the Verrazano Narrows Bridge and these fireworks coming up celebrating the 30th anniversary of the of one of the parks there in Jersey. But those fireworks were the last side of land that we would have that evening for the next 72 days. But I wasn't thinking too much about that for long because I also was doing some other fireworks of myself. I was vomiting my brains out. It turns out I get seasick. And that was going to be hopefully an issue that would resolve itself very quickly. So 10-foot waves were just driving us out of the Verrazano Narrows Bridge and out into the North Atlantic Ocean. And we were surfing down these waves, and Brad and I were taking turns vomiting. Waves were rolling over the gunnels of the boat. And 3 days later, Brad and I were just coming out of this seasickness, and it was just dead calm. It was just absolutely bright blue and hot and humid. And it's just starting to sink in that we have 3,000 and more miles to go before we make it across the sea. And it's starting to settle, like, just what did we get ourselves into? Well, Greg and I are out rowing, and it's hot and the sun's beating down on us. And it's flat and it's calm, and the only sound is the oars going into the water. But sound travels really far on water, and there starts to be something that we hear that is kind of indescribable. We hear it, we stand up and we turn around and we face the bow, and then in the distance, there's this low wall of white water that is traveling, seems to be cascading towards us, and there's no wind. And this doesn't really look like a wave, but it's splashing and it's coming, and it just seems to be across the horizon. Gets closer and closer and closer. And then it's close enough that we can see that it's not one thing, it's not 100 things, it's maybe 1,000, and it's thousands of dolphins that are just crashing around, stampeding, as you might imagine, like bison stampeding across the plain. And we are right in the middle of it. They are looking down in this beautiful clear water. They're stacked 15 feet deep as we can see, and all around us. And we hear them talking to one another. And it's this overwhelming, is it 2 minutes, 5 minutes? It's time just was, did not exist, because this was the most intense experience that we'd ever had with wild animals before. And I think the beauty of this moment is that at the age of in your early 20s, you've seen and imagined so many things, and most things that you might see for the rest of your life, because you've just reached the edge of adulthood. Uh, and as you get older, less and less just amazing things surprise you. When you're a baby and you first see a bird, that is a magical experience. But to have a magical experience like that when you're older, you have a greater appreciation for it. And I had never imagined that it would be possible to experience a stampede of dolphins. We wondered where they were going, and we got a email shortly after they left, because we couldn't escape email even 2006 out on the North Atlantic. It came in through a satellite phone, and one of these mentors back in Seattle, a guy named David Birch, had been doing our weather for us, and he told us that there was a storm coming our way, and it was time to batten down the hatches. And the storm looked something like this. This is the picture that I drew in the sanitarium after I came back from the trip. Just kidding. The storm looked like this, which is a lot more terrifying. This is the perspective of us looking out the bow cabin, and inside this cabin, we are just sitting there, listening to what sound like freight trains moving past us. And so there's a device that we had to hold the bow of the boat into the waves. It's basically a parachute that's tied to the bow of the boat with a long bit of line. And so that holds the water while the bow crashes away. And so those waves are coming, and our boat is riding over them like essentially an end of a whip. So inside the back of this cabin, there's four of us, and it's 6 by 8 feet. It's maybe about 3.5 feet tall, and there's about 850 pounds of human that's packed in there. We're like sardines, and we're sweating, and in between all of these waves, we're just waiting for the wave to pass so we can open up these hatches and let a little bit of air in, but holding them tightly, because when that next wave hits, we don't want it to flip us over, and we don't want any water to get in the cabin, but we're just pouring out sweat, and the wind and the rain is blasting itself against this fiberglass shell, and it sounds like plastic bags getting crumpled into our ears. So right here, this is the North Atlantic Ocean, and what we're looking at after this storm passed was what our route was. So what you're looking at here is the Gulf Stream, and the Gulf Stream is this really powerful current that is so powerful it brings essentially warm weather to Europe. Just the way that it's set up, it gets a bunch of warm water all the way to Northern Europe, and so this is why Northern Europe on that latitude is a lot more temperate than latitudes on the other side of the ocean. But as you can see here, the Gulf Stream is not a straight line like a river going through land. It meanders back and forth, and so it's a massive stream but you have to jump from eddy to eddy. And we're in a very slow boat. We're going about 2 to 3 knots, if that, if we're lucky. And we are trying to find this Gulf Stream because it can have up to 5 knots of current. And if we do that, then we'll have a ride for as long as that current is going in the direction that we want. So we're trying to hunt that down. So this is 2 weeks into this, and we're just trying to find the Gulf Stream, and we're eating and we're rowing and we're eating and we're rowing. And early in the morning on day 16, my buddy Brad comes to me, and we were on shift together, and he wakes up and he says to me, "I need to tell you about the food." And so what had been happening over the last 3 days is that Brad had been seeing how quickly we'd been eating through all this food. And he was the one who had done all the organization for that. We all distributed all the jobs, and this is the one that we had given Brad, one of many that we'd given Brad and that we'd given ourselves. And he had set it up, and uh, this was an absolutely massive job, and it shouldn't have had one person on it. Um, and something was going to happen. And I can say this all in hindsight. We were very angry at the time, but in hindsight, just this was so massive that it needed more people, but that just wasn't the case. Um, and the realization and the responsibility that he felt, I can't even imagine the weight of that. And there was a lot of weight that we all carried going across the ocean. But when this came out, I remember that old man in Ballard who said it's all about how you recover from that first big screw up. And I thought to myself, well, this is it. This is what this crazy old man in Ballard was talking about. This is our big screw up. And like, this is the moment. How we react to this will dictate whether or not this is a success or a failure. And so there was a lot of anger on that boat, but we quashed that and we counted food. And from that moment, we started eating less. So the way that the timing worked with all this is that we were still searching for the Gulf Stream. Brad told us in the morning, and we were still searching for it. So no one ate that day up until about 5 in the afternoon when we checked what our GPS was doing, and we realized we ran a 5-knot current. And at that point, we quit rowing and we just tore the boat apart, and we made a list of all the food we had, and then we just started to eat as little as possible because we'd made good time in 16 days, but we still had thousands of miles to go. So we just ate less. Even our little mascot Rex, who'd been following with us from the very beginning of our adventure, we still ate every day and about 2,200 to just under 3,000 calories. But we were out at sea. We were rowing about 12 hours a day each, and we were only sleeping about really two shifts of about 90 minutes each day, and then we might cat nap here and there, but not a lot of sleep and not a lot of food. And so interesting things started to happen. But the whole time, our goal never changed. We wanted to row across the ocean, and we wanted to win this race. And that did not change. We just did it with a little bit less every day and a little bit more uncertainty. So in addition to rowing, we had to get down and clean the bottom of the boat because this isn't a quick boat and things grow on the bottom of it. So every once in a while, we just had to stop rowing and scrub it down so we wouldn't have to pull along all these little critters. We were blogging every day. We were communicating with people back home with our satellite phone, and there was both great to have this link towards shore, but it also felt like we were breaking ourselves out of the connection, and made us ask, like, what was the use of this privilege of connection, and even at the time, were we using that properly? And you would think that for young men on a boat that the conversations would just start to devolve and get nastier and nastier and nastier, and they did. But at the same time, it was at a wonderful juxtaposition with a great deal more philosophy, as this aesthetic lifestyle of living on a tiny boat and having to be patient with one another, and then having a limited amount of food, started to bring a great deal of reflection some of the time. But I learned a lot of things about myself, and one of those was just how I get angry. I have a very long fuse, and so when Brad told us about the food, you know, I knew that Dylan and Greg were going to have a very hard time with it, and they reacted in an understandable way. And I was thinking, well, if I start beating up on Brad as well, he'll just feel really lonely out here. And, if he felt really, really lonely out here, what's the, not only is that mean, but I mean, what if he shuts down? You can be mean enough to a person that you can make them not function the way that they want to. That could have happened to any of us. And so I felt initially this very strong desire to be very close to Brad. But then I realized that the way that I get angry, it is this long fuse. And as you might imagine, any time you're on a 30-foot boat in the middle of the ocean, someone, little things start to get to you, how they chew, how they move, how they sigh. And this is true for everybody in this boat about me as it was for them. And Brad had been silent a lot after all of this. And one morning he decided he was going to be very chatty with me. And so I told him that I just couldn't talk to him in the morning because I was too hungry. And I was rowing in this position like this. I don't think this captures this particular moment, but it looked a lot like this. And Brad kind of turned his head to the side and was politely silent. And then I decided to speak up, and I didn't turn to Brad. I just piped up and said, Brad, everybody has made mistakes on this trip, but yours was the worst. And he was very silent, and we were rowing, and I could feel that his strength and his frustration pick up in his oars. And for a moment, we were just rowing as hard as we can, which was stupid because that's not going to make that boat that's 3,000 pounds go that much faster. And we were just burning energy uselessly on this anchor. And he says, that's not fair. And I said, I know, and I don't care. And we rowed in silence for a very, very long time after that. And a few days later, I realized the weight that I was carrying with this rage at Brad, and I started to question whether or not what this was, if this was making me feel better, if it was worth it being this mad at this person whom I'd worked this hard to get to this point, and there was so much uncertainty. And I had this realization for several days that I needed to forgive Brad. And it was very hard. And I would think about it a lot while I was rowing along. And then finally, on a day that it was raining outside and we were completely soaked and just gotten into the back of the cabin, I finally was able to turn to him and say, look, whatever happens out here, if we have to, quit and get rescued or worse, I forgive you. And all this emotion, this tears, like they just started pouring out of me. And, but with that came just so much more strength, and the hunger felt a little bit less, and there was a less weight that I was carrying, and I felt like I could be a little bit better for these people that I was rowing with. Just kept rowing, and it was beautiful. We kept rowing through, sometimes the waves would get big, and then the rain would come, and it would be so hard that it would knock several feet off the top of the waves. Sometimes the rain would come and hit and what felt like it was bruising us, this exhaustion of big, fat raindrops. And we'd see these squalls move across the sky as the sun was setting, and it just looked like these dark pink trapezoids moving back and forth on a bright pink sky. And then some days we just couldn't row at all. It's not that we didn't want to row, we hated not rowing, but the weather wasn't bad, but it was coming in the wrong direction. And so we just had to stop. And we put out the sea anchor and we tried to eat as little as possible. And we had the one thing that we had what we felt like the most of, and that was coffee. So we sat on deck while two guys would sleep on the inside, and we'd drink coffee and we'd talk and just wait for the weather to change. And then on top of all that, it was gorgeous. There were some days where the clouds looked like mountains when the sun was rising, and it looked like the sun was rising over these mountains. And as the day becomes a day from the nighttime, it starts from this pitch black, and then it starts to reveal itself in these grays. And then before the sunrise is really the most beautiful colors. And it, you know, I'll say it, like, it really didn't seem like the hunger mattered that much when it was that pretty. And it didn't last that long. And the hunger would come back very quickly. But sometimes it was enough to overwhelm that gnawing feeling inside of you. So back on day 67, where I left us at the beginning, with this freighter heading down on top of us, and no response from the VHF radio, and Greg firing this flare up in the air, and it's starting to, fall. When it goes up, it goes up several hundred feet. It goes up about 1,000 feet, and it burns with 4,000 degrees of magnesium. So it's like just a bit of the sun that has burst for just a few seconds. And we're looking at this ship bear down on us. And we don't really have time to throw up another flare. And we just kind of stare in this vacant way at what's coming for us. And then this massive skyscraper sized ship, like a skyscraper lying on its side, it lists to the side because it turns so hard. And then the VHF radio crackles and this French voice goes, "Don't worry, Robert, we see you." I don't know how French that accent was. And we just kind of sighed. And we were very appreciative that it had missed us, and that we verbalized that it was a close call. And we realized that we couldn't really make any more progress, and that we should probably put out the sea anchor. But we were in the middle of, we were starting to get towards the mouth of the English Channel. And so we needed someone on deck the whole night. And so Greg and I went inside, and Dylan and Brad went out on deck. And Brad ended up going in the bow, and him and Dylan were taking shifts as well. And the usual shift was 2 hours. So I was expecting to get woken up in another 2. And 3 hours later, it might have been 4, I wake up and feeling a lot more rested. Like, it feels very different to wake up at 4 hours, 3 or 4 hours, than it does after 90 minutes. And I woke up, and it was that pre-dawn light. And there was Dylan sitting there. He'd stayed up the entire night watching these ships go by, and a lightning storm had just passed. And he'd given everybody on that boat an extra few hours of sleep when it mattered most. And it was, I hated him for it, because I wanted to be that strong. And I was profoundly grateful. And I looked around, and you could see the lightning storm descending into the night, because you're out there on the ocean and you just see the horizon around you. And night seemed to be drifting away with this lightning storm. And we were so close. And sometime in the next 36 hours, this very slow pace started to feel like we were getting inexorably pulled towards shore. And in the middle of the night, in this pitch black, there was just what seemed like a whisper of a bit of light. Maybe you couldn't really tell. It just looked like for a moment there was a little perhaps a light bubble of something less dark on the horizon, just a little bit. And 30 seconds later, there it was again. And then another 30 seconds passed. And then Brad and Dylan called into the cabin, and we looked at where we were, and we realized that that it could be nothing else but the lighthouse, Rock's lighthouse, which was from that point in a 50 nautical miles south was our finish line. And we could see the finish line at this point. So we kept rowing. And eventually, just the sea allowed us to pass, and land started to reveal itself in the birds. We had an evening where we smelled it, and it smelled like manure, like earth. And as we started to approach this finish line, a fishing boat from Cornwall, which is where we were landing, came out. And even in 2006, it was a beautiful turquoise boat, and it was all wooden. And these two really salty looking Cornishmen came out, and they flipped out their camera phones and took pictures, and they told us we were close. And we knew it because we had GPS. But it still felt good to hear from other people, these other people that we had seen out there. And we cruised along, and very uneventfully in very calm water crossed this finish line and ended up winning the race. But there was more to this story, because there was still 70 miles to shore. And it was, if we touched shore under our own power, we were going to get this Guinness World Record. And we had what felt like just a few more meals left. And so we decided we would go for it. And this ocean seemed to sense our hubris, maybe. And so it whipped up and became more powerful, and seemed like it was more powerful as we were getting towards shore. And the race organizer kept updating our families, who at this point had been waiting weeks longer than we expected them to. Our first half of this race was very fast, and everybody got over there a little bit earlier than they thought they would need to. But now they just been waiting and waiting. And as we got closer, I was pretty sure that my dad would finally have to go back to work, my stepdad. So when I was, my biological dad died when I was 3, and my mom remarried 2 years later to the really wonderful man named Jim Wood. And I think probably that's why I had such a normal childhood, because he was such a wonderful dad that just made things really stable. And because of him, I have this wonderful brother. And so I was really hoping to see him, and just realizing that, I just might not get a chance to do that. So just as we're within sight of land, and it's just becoming the evening, this, little yacht comes out, and on this yacht is everybody's family, except my mom, who gets seasick. And everybody's sitting there, including my dad, and we're just kind of watching each other. And so I think that this is going to be the moment. I won't get to see my dad, but he gets to see me at least within sight of shore. And we can make it just one more day. And now we're just 20 miles away. And there have been days that we've done 100 miles in a day, but the wind is against us and the tide is going out. And it just seems like no matter what, we're going to make it. We're absolutely going to make it, but it's going to be as slow as possible. And so throughout this process, I've been rowing across the ocean in this boat named after my dad with these 3 incredibly supportive guys who are all working through their own stuff. And as we get closer, more and more ships start coming out. So my dad is the James Robert Hanssen, was James Robert Hanssen, had this boat named after him. My stepdad is Jim Wood, and my mom's name is Eve. And so they're sitting on Pendennis Castle, which is this castle that goes out into Falmouth Harbor, and we have to go past Pendennis Castle a mile into Falmouth Harbor. And so they're there, and we can just hear them on shore. And all these other boats have come out to uh, greet us, and we're a mile away. And then this sailboat named Eve sails out, and literally this boat named after my dad and a boat named after my mom cross bow. It's hard not to make you believe in things. As we came into that harbor, this town, which is historic in so many nautical ways, had come out. There were hundreds of people that we had no idea who they were, and the sun was setting and the light was perfect. And as we got towards shore, we pulled out this line that had been wrapped around the dock in New York, and it just sat in the bottom of the boat for months at this point, from June 10th, and it was August 20th, 72 days later. And Brad rolls it up and tosses it to shore. My brother catches it, and we get pulled to land and into the arms of everybody we love. And that's where I'll end it.
Well, Jordan, I don't know. I'm definitely crying. I'm sure some other people are too. That was really, I know everyone's crying. Thank you so much for that. That was really amazing. I think everyone is very engrossed. I'm going to wait a minute to see if anyone after that, take a minute to process, has any questions. You can put them in the chat on Facebook. We have some people there, or in the chat here in Zoom as well. And then I had a question as someone who's had some experiences in the ocean myself. So when you finished and you'd had all this hardship and, you know, this crazy emotional experience, did you think that you would go out again? Was that on your mind, or did you think never again?
Oh, that's a good question. And sometimes I end up, however that last bit ends up, it changes a little bit every time. But there was a very distinct moment rounding, really before we were within earshot of everybody on Pendennis Castle, where I looked out to sea, and I just wanted to turn around and keep going. I just wanted to fill up the boat again with enough food, and I just wanted to go back out to sea. And that feeling just sat with me for a long time, and I would end up going out to sea again, but it was very distinct. I looked out and I thought to myself, this can't be the only time in my life that I'm out here. And I think that I still feel that way right now. I definitely want to get back to sea, but it takes there's a lot of drama that goes into even getting to the starting line with all these ocean rows. And fundraising is, not a really fun process. And you really have to be able to put yourself, mind, body, and soul into that. And right now, I guess I just don't have that. So I look for other opportunities to go out to sea. And I've worked on a fishing boat up in Alaska, and I was a crew member on a beautiful antique schooner going down from Friday Harbor to San Diego. So I've had some chances to do some other things, but yeah, that feeling.
Yeah, a couple of questions have come in on Facebook. One is, how do you think about endurance now? And the other one is, could you see your competitors at all while you were on the open sea?
So yeah, in terms of competitors, we saw Yorkshire Warrior once, still within sight of land in the very first day. Yeah, it was really just a few hours into this. We were passing Coney Island, and I remember looking out and just seeing their boat just kind of pop up above a wave for a few bobs, and that was it. the entire time. I mean, an ocean rowboat disappears very fast out in the middle of the ocean. And so we didn't see them. I didn't see them until they rounded the corner in Falmouth 10 days later. And then as in terms of how I think about endurance, um, I think endurance is a practice. Endurance is definitely, I think, more of a mental game. You know, I think as I get older, you kind of realize that you know your body's not the thing; it's just the vehicle. You know, you eat well, you exercise, you sleep well, just to keep your vehicle working. But the power is in your mind.
Awesome. Couple more coming in on Zoom. Would you ever do it again? I think I know the answer to that. And what's next for you?
Let's see. So I would do it again in the right circumstances. Again, I'd have to, you know, again, it costs a lot of money to do this, and the fundraising is a ridiculous part of it. It's very, very hard, um, and not nearly as much fun. So yeah, given those circumstances, as for what's next, I have been, so I do a tour in Seattle. I do for Airbnb experiences. I take people out on this beautiful little rowboat that I've taken twice down the Mississippi River. And we go start within view of the Space Needle and go check out the birds in the Arboretum. And it is a lot of fun. I've never had a bad time out there. I get very close to beavers and herons and eagles on a very consistent basis. Um, let's see. So I am working on a series of historical novels based in the Pacific Northwest. I just got a job in real estate for Parsons Real Estate up here in Seattle. So I'm figuring out that during the pandemic, and that is an adventure. I'd say that overall, the main thing that I want, that I am working on right now is writing. So everything that I do in my life is in some way designed to support that as I finish these novels. What was the other question?
What was the other question? Oh, would you do it? No, I think you got both of them. Would you do it again? What are you doing now? Another one, how is your current relationship with your crewmates?
So it's great. I talk to one of these guys every day. And which one it is, you know, just kind of changes on what's going on. But just to give you an example of kind of what you know, you could call it, this brotherhood would mean. Greg and Brad probably had the hardest time with one another before we even went out to sea. And they both talked about it. And that was certainly very disconcerting to observe. Um, and when the food issue happened, you know, I was just, and at the time, like Greg's like, I'll never be able to forgive Brad about this. And it seemed that way for, you know, years and years. And I don't know if like Brad and Greg have ever had any kind of resolution like that. I'm not privy to that. But what I am privy to is people's actions. And when Brad got married, he absolutely needed Greg there, and Greg needed to be there. And he lives down in Montecito in, you know, Santa Barbara, and they recently had a few years ago a mudslide. And Greg and I were the first two that were able to make it down there when they started letting people come in to help, so we could help dig them out. And there was just no question about that. We were going to make that happen if we could. And Greg and I were in a position to have a flexible enough schedule to do that. Dylan's job was more of a you know, consistent, you know, 9 to 5. But you know, Greg's a PT, and he lived pretty close by. And I have a schedule that's a little bit more flexible because I do a bunch of different things. So we were able to make that happen. And that's just the way that goes, I guess. I mean, I think um, I'd say it's great. I mean, I mean, that's great. It's really more of a brotherhood.
I don't see any more questions at the moment, but if you guys leave them on Facebook, I know that Jordan will see them. And I had one more last question about the food. I saw a lot of tuna fish in the stuff that was left. So can you still eat tuna fish, or does it like take you right back to that moment? Do you have any food associations?
Well, it's funny because we had a polenta sponsor, and so like
Polenta.
polenta.
Yeah.
And the thing is like after that trip, I was thinking, man, I'm never going to be able to eat polenta, never again. But I love polenta. I love it. I think it's so good. I mean,
How long did that take?
it's a few years,
It was a
but
few years.
man,
Yeah.
I love it. I mean, it's hard to really get behind a bag of canned tuna, but
Right. Yeah.
in the right circumstances, it's delicious, and sometimes it's the best thing you need. But I don't go seeking that out. I'll talk more about the so from the second trip, and I won't get too much into that. But I had a crewmate who we did the food obviously a lot better because we had practice on the second trip, and Adam was Adam, he was late at night when like our late night snack were these little soups, and you just put some water in it, you mix it up, and at the time it was just delicious. And Adam went on and on and on about, oh man, when I'm at home, like I'm gonna bring this out as a snack, and it's gonna be great. It's just gonna be a little like something to warm me up in a mid-afternoon thing. I heard from him months after. It was like, I tried those soups. They're terrible. So like there is a certain spice that hunger, hard work, and the sea can add to a
Right.
lot of things.
It becomes a lot about food, I think. Sometimes, or it can anyway. So what are we going to do next week?
So next week we're going to do the second ocean row, which ended in a different kind of drama. Still the same boat, a new crew, and a new part of the ocean, and new challenges.
Awesome. Well, thanks again so much, Jordan. I always love getting the chance to see you, and I'm excited for next week. So same time, same day, we will be back. So we'll put the link out for that soon, and we appreciate everybody coming. And we did get it live on Facebook this time, so I'm happy with my technology win. So I think that's all I have. Jordan, anything else?
That's covered. Thanks so much for coming. I really appreciate it. It's fun to share the story.
Yeah, it's always great to hear from you. And I'll talk to you soon, and we'll see everybody else next week. Thank you.
See ya. Bye bye.